This is Shameen Prashantham. I am Professor of International Business and Strategy and an Associate Dean at China-Europe International Business School and author of the book, Gorillas Can Dance, Lessons from Microsoft and Other Corporations on Partnering with Startups. On this show, we will talk about the why, how, and where of partnering between corporations and startups, about how middle managers can be catalysts of true change in teaching gorillas to dance, and about how the asymmetries between large companies and startups can be turned into not only a win-win, but a truly meaningful partnership. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our delicious conversation with Dr. Shameen Prashantham. He is a professor of international business and strategy and associate dean at China-Europe International Business School in Shanghai, China. He teaches across the world, everywhere from Edinburgh to Zurich and a lot of places in between. On top of that, he is the author of Gorillas Can Dance. And we've been talking about this asymmetrical relationship and and the paradoxes in it of how one side can add to the other. It's not one-sided between these giant gorilla organizations and the startups. We were talking about how to reach out, how to make sure you make that connection. And we've talked about how a lot of these larger organizations, these gorillas, often will develop a skunk works to develop innovation. And the frustration of that has been, up until recently, that a lot of times the people involved in those sort of get left on the periphery. It doesn't get to be integrated, and it causes problems in a culture. It causes all kinds of challenges. So we want to start there. We want to start with this paradox of asymmetry, and we also want to talk about how we can get those peripheral skunkworks ideas, these innovative ideas, these startup company pieces to come into the main stay of the organization, to be part of the stable and actually bring everything forward. So let's jump in from there.
So, Doug, exactly as you say, there is this very interesting challenge that big companies have as they're trying to reach out to startups, based on the recognition that they need to be more entrepreneurial. The world is changing around them. They have to do things differently, and it's generally a struggle for a big established company. So on the one hand, it sounds like a marriage made in heaven. The big company has the scale, the reputation, the legitimacy. The startups have the agility, the creativity, and so on. And so if there is the promise of complementarity between these capabilities. But in fact, when big companies have tried working with startups, what I've observed in over a decade of research is that they then get frustrated because, as it were, the very differences that make it attractive to work together also make it difficult, or at least not straightforward to do so. And that's the paradox. And so then, you could walk away from this and say it's all very frustrating, or you could persevere. And the companies that I've studied, be they Microsoft from the tech world, Bayer from the world of pharmaceuticals, BMW, Nissan from automotive, Walmart from retailing. So in other words, from a range of industries, I found that there are three things that they try to do to address this. And so the starting point is you need to unpack what the asymmetries are. And there are many, but three that I think are particularly relevant. One is the asymmetry of goals. These companies want different things and at different timescales, which is very important. Yes. And then there's the asymmetry of structure. It's not the same as two big companies engaging with each other. Much easier to find role counterparts. Vice president of marketing of one can reach out to the vice president of marketing of the other. Much more difficult with a corporation or startup. And the third is what I call the asymmetry of attention. Big companies see an ocean of startups out there, and they aren't sure which startups are worthy of their limited managerial attention. The startups know who the big companies are, but they struggle to get the attention of the people that matter within the company, the key decision makers. So startups can waste a lot of time going from pillar to post. So corresponding to these three asymmetries, what I've observed companies do is that, first of all, to address the asymmetry of goals, they clarify what the synergy is. Is it a building block synergy? Are we a tech company that has, cloud computing platforms or other technological platforms? We want startups to build on top of this, and the synergies we could potentially co-sell. So there's revenue for both. Or is it a pain point synergy, which you find in a lot of traditional sector companies? Oh, we realize as a car company that digitalization is more and more critical, but our cybersecurity isn't as great as it might be. We then want to engage with startups who then offer solutions, and we, in effect, become their clients. But it's a strategic partnership because this is core to us. So that sounds blindingly obvious, but I mean, making clear what the win on either side is important, clarifying the synergy.
Yes.
And then the second is creating the interface. And these interfaces, meaning a first port of call. So I'm a startup, I want to engage with you, Mr. Gorilla. Which entity do I speak to first? And now you find BMW, Startup Garage, Unilever, Foundry, Microsoft for startups. But these can also be structured differently. So the interface can be cohort-like, for example, Microsoft's accelerators. You become part of a peer group having a very structured set of interactions, and the peer interactions are also an important part of it. Or you could have more of a funnel-like interface where you don't get to meet the other startups. The big company has a goal and they sort of screen you out along the way till they get the small set of startups that they want. Each has its own strengths. Funnels are good for predictability, but cohorts are good for serendipity. You may have unanticipated outcomes.
Yes.
And then thirdly, cultivating exemplars or showcasing success stories in a very intentional way, because that then helps you to understand what success can look like to both parties. So the big company managers are able to prioritize their attention better. And the startups also understand better, first of all, is this a gorilla worth talking to? And if yes, what are they looking for? Because if I'm able to deliver on that, I'm more likely to get the attention of the people that matter. So synergy, interface, exemplar is a framework that I observed across different companies, and I think can be helpful for companies to address this paradox of asymmetry.
Yeah, because it is a paradox. You said in part one of the show, you were talking about how you sort of came from a background of NGOs and which is not a guerrilla and is not a startup. And obviously you've done your PhD and you've got your doctorate and you've done all your research with these major gorillas and finding out who can dance and who can't. But really all this is asking for a change in way of doing business for the startup and for the gorilla is asking us to think in a different way. And I think that, well, I know that change is often difficult for individuals, let alone organizations. So let's look at that at a very personal level. What was the turning point in your life, in your leadership, in your quote business philosophy? What was the turning point for you? Because oftentimes we need to get sort of shoved off a cliff. In my literal case, in my case, it was quite literal getting shoved off a cliff. But in some cases, it's not that. What was it for you? What was that turning point?
Well, I suppose, one can think of many turning points, but moving to China a decade ago was, I think, a major turning point in my career as well, because it suddenly opened my eyes to very different assumptions even about how business is conducted. So I'd already had a pretty decent understanding of three contexts. I'd I'd say, the UK, the US, and India.
Mm-hmm.
And there's actually a lot of diversity even there. There's advanced
Absolutely.
economies, emerging economies, and so on. But in a sense, there's also a common thread
Yes.
across the three, partly because of historical connections with the UK, I think.
Yeah.
And then mainland China, as opposed to, say, Hong Kong, which also has that British link. But mainland China, I mean, it just was very fascinating. I could see, so for example, even the way the internet was developing, in terms of the way business is done, you know, you have very different ecosystem giants here compared to the West. So what's common in the US, UK, and India is it's the same large multinationals in the technology space that dominate. You know, the Google of India is Google, the Facebook of India is Facebook. Not so in China. And so that was very interesting and forced me to start broadening my thinking. And also at a more philosophical level, also I realized that certainly people who get a sort of more westernized education in India, certainly the UK, US, I think a lot of the way of thinking is driven, I think, ultimately by Greek philosophy, you know, a linear logic. And then in China, I was exposed to actually very different paradigms, you know, the notion of yin yang. Yeah, exactly.
Yin yang, you've got Tao, all that thinking, right?
Exactly. And so holding in your mind seemingly contradictory elements, that was very interesting to me. And then, and very influential in what we were talking about. So when you're dealing with paradox, the issue is you're dealing with tensions. And this can actually be very challenging cognitively. You know, it creates dissonance. You know, I'm trying to focus on the short term, but I'm also trying to think about the long term. I need to be local, yet also global for a big company. And I think there was something about what I picked up here is it's necessary and okay to let these contradictory tensions coexist. And so I think this was a major turning point, helped me personally, and also influenced my work in this area.
It's very interesting because thank you for sharing that, because I tell you why that's interesting personally, is because I studied the Tao extensively, but I also studied Vedanta, as well as Kabbalah and Gnostic and Coptic Christianity. And I know that I found that in the Tao but also in Kabbalah, that it was important to hold two ideas at the same time. In my sitting with masters, and I'm very grateful to have done that. Very oftentimes I would be sitting with one of my teachers I can think of in particular, who would bring up a passage, and then if 6 of us in the room and say, argue for or against the passage as you choose, but you cannot repeat anything anybody else said, including me who just read you the passage. And the idea of it was to find a way of holding both things or as right, holding both things as possible that seem to be in conflict. And I think that this is one of the great changes we need in our world today. Because as you know, I do a political advisement as well. And part of my guidance around that is, how can you hold two things that are completely separate together, two things that seem to be conflictual at the same time, and not seem like a flip-flotter, because that's not what we're talking about, not seeming like you've got no grounds, but saying, let's find the dignity in both. And so in many ways, negotiating the dance between the guerrilla and the startup is exactly that. It's holding, as you talked about, the values, the goals, the structure and the culture of both at the same time, and going, it's easy to stand on one side and goes, those guys they're whacked. Right. They're out of it. They're whacked. And on the other side going, no, you guys are whacked. And in the other side to come at it and say, hold on a second, what instead of that, what if there's an advantage to that we can bring to each other? And that's what I loved about the book. That's what I love about the concept of the book, is that very thing is not just the asymmetry, but moreover the call. That's what I would say it is, the call to seeing both sides as advantageous to each other. Whereas we've had a very black and white, almost political idea that, you know, if you're a big guy, this is what you're about. And if you're a startup, this is what you're about. And never the twigs shall meet. You know, we are the Catholics and the Protestants of Ireland back in the day. Right. And it's just not true, right? There's a commonality, which is in that case with Christianity, but there's a commonality of how can we serve as an organization? How can we serve our culture? How can we serve our clients? So I love that that's what you're bringing forward. And it's really interesting to me that China brought that out in you, that brought that forward.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you for your kind words and for synthesizing these ideas so beautifully. And yes, indeed, I think that was a very important role that China played in this process, which was unanticipated. My goal was to sort of complete my understanding of the world in a sense by including this very important economy, but I got far more than I bargained for.
Well, one of the things you talk about in the book is the why, the where, the how, the why, and the where of partnering, and that is the willingness for both sides to recognize that my why might not be your why, and that doesn't mean yours is wrong. My where might be different than yours, and my how might be different than yours. Talk to us a little bit about that, because I think that's an important thing for everybody to grasp, because this seems very big and sometimes insurmountable. As a big organization, no, how do we find this needle in a haystack? There are so many of these startups. And on the other side, how do we get through the wall, past the gatekeepers, and not get eaten by the gorilla, right? So let's talk about those three pieces.
Right. So the why, the starting point from the big company's point of view is we need to be more entrepreneurial. There's a need for more entrepreneurial leadership. And well, actually, we can do a lot of things on the inside, and I think that's really important. But there's also so much energy and talent on the outside. And the startup's perspective there is recognizing that the world, that, you know, increasingly you have these ecosystems of partners being orchestrated by inevitably larger, more powerful companies. And so part of what the startup's trying to do is to create and capture value for itself by participating in these ecosystems. And so I think that's, broadly speaking, the why. When you're dealing with the how, that's where the paradox of asymmetry comes into play, what we were talking about earlier. So a big part of this how, for me, is the synergy interface exemplar framework. But what I'd also add there is, in relation to what we were talking earlier about bringing things from the periphery to the core, it's also important for the managers, and often they are middle managers who start the process in a bottom-up way. You know, so in Unilever, there was this very interesting guy called Jeremy Bassett, who was a marketing manager, but had this sense that, you know, we have to do more than just try to create intrapreneurship programs. We need to engage with startups on the outside. And he founded this Unilever Foundry program. And, you know, I find the story replicated in many places. But then what becomes important is for these individuals to reach towards the higher levels of the organization and get these internal champions who buy into it, who then give them air cover to keep pushing and legitimize this within the organization. Otherwise, you know, it's not going to go very far, and others aren't going to get excited to be part of it. But also, you know, reaching out to people in business units, so they could be like peers, but people with P&L responsibilities. And then more broadly, having a range of what I call roving ambassadors within the organization, people who know about this, who have goodwill towards this, Someone else I saw doing this extremely well was Shilpa Patel at Nissan's luxury brand, Infinity. And, I mention names to emphasize that in the end, it comes down to people. And not always people at high levels in the organization, but people who are committed, who show entrepreneurial leadership. And then realize that they need to get a lot of other people on board for this thing to continue. So a big part of the how then is in effect building a startup partnering capability within the organization. And that involves being a bridge not only with startups on the outside, but with a lot of people on the inside. And in fact, I think that's the harder task for these people.
Well, coming back to what you said there, there's an example you gave. I just think is a great example because I think that there may be people. I'm sure there are people watching and listening to us who are middle managers and feeling a bit like toothless tigers in that they get to give orders to those below them, but they're kind of those above them might be a little deaf to them. And they feel frustrated with that. And you gave me a really wonderful example when we spoke last time about somebody from BMW. And I'd love for you to share that story, because that's, for me, is a great example of if you're feeling like, as you're watching this or listening to this thing, you're like, yeah, that's great, but I'm not in a position of power. I can't really do anything. And there's a great example of somebody who maybe took that and decided to run with it.
In fact, I would put Gregor Gimme at BMW in the same category of people. I was just talking about Jeremy Bassett at Unilever, Shilpa Patel at Nissan. And so Gregor had joined BMW from IDEO in Silicon Valley, and he ended up co-founding and running the BMW startup garage. And he very quickly realized that if they were to connect with startups and, at an emotional level and, have these startups believe BMW was serious about talking to them, then he would have to format the communication in ways that may not be consistent with the corporate identity. And so he decided to design the website a little bit differently and to even do the interiors of a meeting room that startups could come to very differently. And he just went ahead and did it. And the next day he got a call without permission. And he got a call from corporate and identity, and he thought he was in trouble. But they were calling to congratulate him on the website and to say, can we use this meeting room from time to time for some of our meetings too? And he says, I came from Silicon Valley with the notion that it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. And a lot of BMW insiders would have felt that simply won't work at BMW. But he was willing to take a calculated risk, and it worked. But I'll tell you one other thing. What I discovered as I dug into this a little bit more is that Gregor was the face of BMW Startup Garage to the outside world. He showed up on a lot of videos and a lot of talks, startup ecosystem events, but he was actually part of a pair. And his partner in crime was this BMW insider who had been at BMW for a long time. And he, I think, was very important in having a balancing role in helping to figure out the internal politics, making sure that any risks they took were calculated and not an overreach. So I think having that combination actually can make a huge difference.
Yeah, so it wasn't craziness.
That's right.
But it was just enough craziness.
Exactly right. Yes.
The reason I wanted that example is because if you think about BMW, the Bavarian Motor Works, that's a German company. And if you're going to think about rules, you're probably going to think about a German company, right?
Indeed.
So, it's like, oh, we ain't breaking the rules. But that was done very well there and very effectively.
Yes, exactly.
One of the things you talked about when we were speaking was thinking about startups here, as in the West, engaging with startups, large companies, and starting. How do the startups engage in companies in China and India?
So that's a great question. And in fact, you had asked me to comment on the why, the how, and the where. And so this is a great opportunity to talk about the where as well. And I think, so first of all, a lot of Western companies over time figured out that they could engage with startups around the world, including in emerging markets. In the case of Microsoft, I think Israel had a pivotal role in this. When the Microsoft Israel team got involved and then took over global leadership, I think a lot of attention turned east as well to China and India. And I think a lot of Western companies are also realizing they can gain visibility to some new technologies that aren't as widely prevalent in the West. So things like QR codes and a lot of mobile internet related things. I've seen Budweiser, for example, working with a Chinese startup doing things here for the first time. Putting QR codes on the bottom of bottle caps and incentivizing customers to scan them so that the company can form a direct relationship with their customers. And the incentive is you get a free beer on your birthday if you're a loyal customer. And then they were able to take this idea to other places as well. But there's also scope, I think, for international startups to work with these Asian giants over time. In the Chinese context, I suppose it's easier to do it in China at the moment. And India is a little bit different because they don't have the equivalent of the homegrown giants just yet. But they have a different set of other giants. So they have traditional companies, the Tatas and Mahindras and Birlas of the world, who are showing an appetite for more innovation. And so Tata, for example, I know, have an innovation fund where they try to engage with innovative startups around the world, including the West. And you also have these big Indian software services companies like Infosys and so on, who also are engaging with startups. I think in the Indian situation, for Western companies, in many cases, it will just feel like more of the same, because I think many Western startups interact with Indian managers in Western companies in the West. I think China represents something fundamentally different. And of course, data needs to be managed sensitively and carefully. And I think the way most companies are going about this is now to deal with China data separately from the rest of the world data. But I think in all of these cases, the key point is that emerging markets will remain very important as a source of innovation. So whether it is emerging market startups engaging with Western companies, Western startups engaging with emerging market corporations, I think that there's great opportunity to bring together complementary capabilities here. And with the emerging markets, the speed is just flabbergasting, really. Taking advantage of that for both sides, I think that's a great opportunity going forward.
Okay, so that's interesting. So looking at that as we sort of get towards the end of our second part here, one of the things I'm really interested to hear from you is, because of all your research, because of your work in both the East and the West, in both sides, you've been looking at these companies, you've been looking at what they're doing, you've even had your own perspective changed. What do you see as the future of work? What do you see the future of, is there things we're maybe not paying enough attention to here in, I think one of the things for me is I've lived in many different places around the world, and I think I don't think I know that there's always a bias to your place, wherever you are. It's just the way it is. So as a result, I think that oftentimes we're ignorant or in denial. What do you see as the future of work based on all the work you're doing, all the research that you're doing?
That's a very, very good question. What immediately comes to my mind, Dov, at this point in time is that I think there is an accentuated search for meaning on the part of people who are in organizations at different levels and in different parts of the world, both in the large companies and the startups. I think this was coming, but I think the pandemic has also turbocharged this. And so people want to find meaning in work. What that means, therefore, is that they want to see a link between their day-to-day activities and the particular focus of their company and some higher purpose, some broader goals. And so, for example, someone was telling me how at Johnson Controls, a company that makes elevators, there is now this growing sense that what we're doing is a lot more than making boxes that people get into and save some breath, going up a few floors instead of taking the stairs, to figuring out how to make this as energy efficient as possible, how to figure out ways in which you can actually save a few seconds of power usage here or there, which in a large building with a lot of elevators can translate into fairly big savings of energy. And then all of a sudden you're saying, hey, actually, I'm part of an effort to deal with the climate change crisis. Now, I don't think I think it's primarily about the perspective that is being changed here. And I think, therefore, the meaning of finding meaning out of work is something that's going to be extremely important. And I think will also affect the way in which corporate innovation is conducted in companies, as well as the specific aspect of partnering with startups. So another part of the world that became very important to me in the recent past was Africa. My school has a small campus there. And that's where it began to dawn on me, and then I saw examples of this in other places as well, that partnering between large and small organizations, non-traditional allies, can be a powerful force for contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals. You know, those 17 goals that the United Nations adopted in September 2015, for which the 2020s was going to be this decade of action because the target is to get there by 2030. And then the pandemic has happened and the way we do work has changed. And many of us are constrained in different ways and so on, but we're also liberated in other ways. I think absolutely what digital technology has allowed us to do, what we are doing right now, in completely different parts of the world, but also this focus on, is what I'm doing meaningful ultimately? And so you take something like climate change. So the COP26 meetings in Glasgow in November, I think, helped many businesses realize that now this is non-negotiable. And then the question is, what can we do productively? And I think the scale of big companies, the agility of startups is going to be absolutely critical to bring together. And so if corporations can increasingly emphasize how what they're doing relates to the greater good, and this is true of startups, though I think in startups this happens a little bit more instinctively, I think that could be a very powerful force for making work more meaningful, more rewarding for people.
I think you're absolutely right. I know that I have done lots of work with startups, but I do work with large companies. And I find that oftentimes they are saying, you know, we need to be more meaning driven. We understand that, but they don't understand the bottom line of it. And it is very bottom line driven. And I think that the great resignation has brought that to the fore, with now there's a shortage on talent because people are like, you know what, this doesn't mean anything to me. And I give an example that I was invited to work with a national company that manufactures and delivers pipes, and I was like, oh, this is exciting. Not. And I wasn't particularly excited about it, but I did get what I wanted to do was to meet the owner, who was the guy who started the whole thing, who, you know, this is a national organization. It's massive for the country. And he started out as a pipe fitter. I was like, wow, so I'm looking forward to meeting this guy. And he was ready to walk away from his own company, and hand it over. And after we did the work, he's like, I'm not going anywhere. You've just re-triggered. Because what we found was that the meaning of the organization was not about pipes. It was like, well, where do these go? And he talks about it all. And I said, tell me a community that can exist without pipes. And he goes, there isn't one. I go, so are you laying pipes or are you building communities? And he's like, oh my God, that's it. And that's why he's like, we're not leaving. And everybody from the salespeople to the manufacturers to the corporate execs was suddenly in the community building business, which is meaning, and everybody could get around that. Everybody could get their hands on that. Everybody could take that in. And that's why I think you're so right about that being the future of business, is adding meaning. And it's what we've all got to do. And it can't be, let's dress it up and give it some bogus meaning. I mean, we got to feel the emotional connection to it, because as much as we'd like to think the business is bottom line, it is, but the other bottom line is the emotional connection to your product by the people who work for you and the people who buy from you. So that's a great insight. Thank you so much, Shameen. I've loved the conversation. Thank you again. I really appreciate it. Again, please tell our audience where they can find out more about you and your resources in the book and all the ways that they can reach out.
Thank you, Doug. Before I do that, can I just say it's been such a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, sir.
It's just been fantastic. And something I've never mentioned before is that I had a backup title for the book in case the publishers weren't comfortable with Gorillas Can Dance, which was The Fast and the Curious.
Oh, there it is.
Indeed.
The Fast and the Curious. I love it.
Well, anyway, yeah. So thank you. This has been great. And for anyone who wants to know more, please check out www.gorillascandance.com. And you can find me on LinkedIn as well.
Of course. And of course, we will make sure that all the links are published in there and inside the show notes so you can find them. And remember that you can hang out with other conscious leaders. You can chat about this episode or any past episodes inside of our Facebook and LinkedIn groups. Just look for the Leadership and Loyalty Podcast. It doesn't matter how successful you are. If your employees and your customers don't understand what gives your company meaning, you're only working at a fraction of your true capability. To find out how you can hire me, Dov Baron, as a speaker or leadership strategist for yourself or your organization, simply go to dovbaron.com. That's DOVBARON.com, because unified actualized meaning is the one single monolithic difference between mediocrity and greatness for all individuals and companies. I want to thank you for sharing the show with everybody you know. Till next time, stay curious, my friend. Stay curious about how you, if you're a startup, can dance with gorillas, and if you're a gorilla, how you can dance with startups. I'm Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into your deepest meaning to reach that next level of clarity, focus, purpose, and profit in your business, your life, and your leadership impact. And I am out.